Welcome to our panel session, Assurance of Learning in the Age of GenAI. Can assessment for inclusion and security coexist? I'm Sue and I'm the lecturer for inclusive education here at Deakin. This event is the result of a collaboration at Deakin University between Inclusive Education, Cradle and the Redefining Assessment Project. The session will be recorded and everyone who registered will be sent a link to the recording. Hello to everyone joining us in the room, to those of you joining online and to the people watching the event recording, and welcome to our panellists. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the country that we're on. We meet today on many different lands. I want to particularly acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Wadawurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation and the Peak Wurrung people of the Ma Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which Deakin campuses are located. We pay our respects to their elders and ancestors and acknowledge their continuing connection to land, water and sky. Their sovereignty was never ceded. Now, this is a session about assurance of learning approaches that are inclusive. So for me, that inclusion starts with a second acknowledgement. Many First Nations cultures worldwide, including Indigenous Australian cultures, have used oral knowledge transmission and assessment for thousands of years in ways that effectively assure learning. They have long established approaches to maintain authenticity and contextualisation of knowledge, accuracy, integrity and inclusion. Universities as institutions have often dismissed those oral knowledges and assessment approaches as too subjective and as invalid. Before we move forward, I want to clearly acknowledge that the approaches we discuss today are not new. All oral, practical or relational assessment methods we discuss today have their roots in Indigenous ways of knowing. We are using very old solutions to new problems. So a few pieces of housekeeping. Our panel will run for 60 minutes, followed by 30 minutes of audience Q&A. After that, there'll be refreshments for the in-person attendees at 3:30 p.m. Sorry, online people. I'm sure you can have your own refreshments. And for online participants, please put your questions into the Q&A, not into the chat. You can upvote your favourites. For in-person participants, I'll ask you to wait for the microphone for accessibility reasons if you have questions. If you do have questions online and in person for a specific panellist, please make sure that that's clear in your question. Now, one of our panellists who is online now, Maria, she's going to leave after the main session due to teaching commitments. But if there are questions specifically for her, then she's kindly agreed to answer them later and we can send that through with all of the resources from the event. A couple of other notes just to make sure that our panel is as inclusive as possible. This panel explicitly welcomes diverse perspectives and contributions of both attendees and panellists. Inclusion for panellists might mean being understanding that people's knowledge or perspective is no less important if they're nervous, if they make mistakes, or if they have differences in their presentation style. Inclusion for our audience means being responsive to evolving needs. Captions are available, however, if you can't hear us or we're speaking too fast, please indicate in the chat. We'll have someone monitoring that here and we'll respond by either slowing down or speaking up. I want to also mention that each of our panellists speaks on their own behalf, not on behalf of Deakin, their faculty or anyone else. And particularly the two students who are joining us here today, they can't speak on behalf of all students. And so they don't. They're just talking about their own experiences, their own observations and what's been shared with them. This month, Thomas Corbin and others at Cradle published a paper describing AI and assessment as a wicked problem. This is worth highlighting as it serves as a useful lens to view our conversation today. So what is a wicked problem? Wicked problems, among other things, can't be easily defined. They don't have clearly defined success criteria, and they do have many, many potential solutions. Each of the solutions results in a series of trade-offs. It's hard to test and it can't be trialled without real consequences for someone. In this situation, that's usually the student or the educator. I think that's useful. It highlights the value of sharing knowledge and experience and working collaboratively on these solutions. Just like the bushfire in the image here, the problem's too large to solve by ourselves. That makes events like this critical, but it also means that no one at this event or any other will have all the answers. Some aspects of this issue won't even have a solution yet. So as you interact with each other during the event, particularly in the chat and the Q&A, please remember that everyone is learning and adapting as they go, and we all want to feel safe to share our knowledge and our perspectives and learn together. Solutions can sometimes be very contextual and some might not fit your situation, but having different perspectives will shine light on different parts of the problem, and some solutions will help you to realise other issues that could that you might not have noticed. A final note before we start: we're really keen to keep this conversation going, including by supporting and sharing exemplars and case studies of assessment practices that address both inclusion and assurance of learning. We want to help build on each other's practice. So if you've got a great example, we'd really love to hear from you. We have a short form to fill out and all contributors will be acknowledged. So you can access the nomination form using the link or the QR code on the screen, and that link's being shared in the chat right now. We'll share it again at the end, so don't worry if you don't catch it right now. So let's get started. Our higher education regulator in Australia, TEXA, has made it clear that we need ways to assure learning, to make sure that students can actually do what we've set out for them, to make sure that we know what to make sure that students can actually do what we've set out for them to learn and achieve. As GenAI makes it even more possible to generate and outsource written tasks such as essays, there have been recommendations to return to predominantly in-person supervised tasks. But there have been concern that this is going to decrease equity and inclusion of assessments. So I'm going to start with a question for Will. Will Cook is a fourth-year student pursuing a double degree in law and cybersecurity. He's been deeply involved in the AI space at Deakin and has expanded his knowledge by studying AI law at the University of Exeter. Over the years, Will has integrated AI into his studies and contributed to Deakin's resources and student guides on AI. His passion for AI and law drives him to explore the intersection of these fields, aiming to make a significant impact in the future. Will, to start us off and to frame our conversation, knowing that you don't speak for all students, how important is assurance of learning from a student perspective?
Well, thanks, Sue. I think, the student perspective when it comes to assurance of learning, I think is very, very important. I think as a student, I've seen things in news where there are institutions that lose their licenses, students lose their degrees, students who spent thousands of dollars and then all of a sudden they don't have a degree anymore. And that's, not just time, but it's also money. Um, I think, as a student, I'm concerned as well that with tools like AI, what is, what does it mean to have assurance of learning within, my cohort? How do I know, especially with a subject like law um, where grades can be very important, depending on what you want to do post your degree, if you want to do a master's, if you want to go into a particular space, marks can be very, very important and very competitive. And if we have some people who, are using AI to, um, help them and others who aren't, I guess that raises an assurance of learning issue, but also an equity issue where some students, might be left out. I think with assurance of learning, um, I forgot the point I was going to make. It was a good one.
You can come back to it if you like. What I'm hearing at the moment is that assurance of learning is really important so that your degree means something and so that you're not worried that it's going to be taken away from you. And if grades are important, which they are in some fields, that those grades mean something too, and they're hopefully achieved by merit more than by inequity.
Yeah, and I guess on that point, as we go into the future, we see AI taking over jobs and things like that. And I guess that those core skills that, we get from university, um, those are what's going to define us. And I guess being able to assure our learning and show that we've actually got the learning is going to be what helps set us apart, I guess, from others who might not have that same assurance.
Thanks so much, Will. Connor, I'd love to hear from you. Connor Coombs is a first year social work student with 6 years of experience in higher education, having completed a Bachelor of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Swinburne University. He is passionate about student accessibility, especially in the neurodivergent and mental health spaces. Connor currently works as a student partner and is treasurer for the Deakin Geelong Disability and Neurodivergency Association, bringing lived experience as a person with ADHD, navigating higher education, and the new dynamic artificial intelligence brings to the learning environment. Connor, typically assurance of learning tasks are the ones that are in person. And with a shift away from written exams, they now often involve speaking or interaction. So these are the things that include presentations, practical exams, OSCEs, which are clinical exams, a little bit like a role play, and professional conversations, sometimes vivas, where you're potentially being questioned by a panel, and more recently, interactive oral assessments, where the student plays the role of an expert and the marker is in the role of a client or a person needing help or advice. Connor, from either your own lived experience across several institutions or from what you've seen in the disability and neurodivergent spaces, can you tell me about your concerns and your hopes in regard to accessibility and inclusion as we see an increase in these types of assessments?
Thanks, Sue. Well, one of my immediate concerns would be just accessibility and allowances for people with various conditions that can affect their ability to sort of verbally present something. Some thoughts that come to mind are people with voice disorders. In my current case, a fear of public speaking, and just general anxiety amongst various others. And in my experience, a lot of the time, particularly bias in marking is actually quite a large concern. As someone who has usually different body language to, I suppose, the expected sort of presenter skill set, um, often markers can sort of affect your grades using depending on how the rubric is designed. For example, on multiple of my oral presentations I've had to do, usually presentation skills is like a section of the rubric. And if you're not good at doing things like maintaining eye contact or having a sort of open vibe, I guess, um, then that you can receive kind of harsh marks depending on how that rubric is designed. However, in terms of hopes, though, you've kind of highlighted some of them in the question you've asked, where movement away from the written examination, I think, is really good, especially moving away from traditional rote-based sort of learning and testing. I myself can't really do exams very well because my memory just isn't designed. Doesn't work in a viable way for examination. But I believe it also helps that verbal assessment would allow people to move away from courses over reliance on essays. I think that's good for a multitude of reasons, including being able to develop a better rounded set of skills. So instead of it all being essays, you've also got the ability to help with public speaking or sort of one-on-one stuff. In my case, in social work, um, oral communication is actually a huge part of the job. And so being able to kind of help students develop multiple skill sets and also allow students with different strengths to shine, I think is really important.
Thanks so much, Connor. So I'm hearing it's a bit of a mixed bag at the moment. You're excited because you'll be able to show some of your strengths and develop new strengths in the oral communication, so in person, presenting, all of those things. But you're a little bit concerned that if it's not done in an inclusive way, that it can disadvantage students and you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Basically, while I can't speak to a lot of the things I mentioned, such as voice disorders and more generalized anxieties, um, they definitely are a real problem. I've met people with voice disorders, and they've all encountered a sort of wall where there's a lot of assumption that goes into those sort of things, like just because someone can't speak properly, then it's like an intelligence issue and things like that, which I suppose, given how long it took the education system, at least in my experience, to sort of allow accessibility in terms of written exams, my concern is that same sort of delay will occur with oral presentations and things like that as well.
Yeah. So we really need to work on in-building these adaptations so that they're not something that we have to wait for, and perhaps consider what's in the rubrics from the start. Are we needing to assess presentation skills? Is it part of the learning outcomes? Those sorts of things. Thanks so much, Connor. Turning now to Maria online. Maria Ray is a senior lecturer in politics and policy in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences and previously worked as a newspaper journalist. Her research interests include political communication, media, podcasts, and digital journalism. More recently, she's studying the sound of politics through voice, power, and audio technology. She's a research fellow at Cradle and is working on a project about oral presentations, women students, and inclusivity. Her work has been published in New Media and Society, the Journal of Radio and Audio Media, Continuum, the International Journal of Communication and Media, and Culture and Society. Maria, as I just mentioned, you've been working on a project about oral presentations and inclusivity. What can you tell us about that project and some of the ways that oral presentations are or aren't inclusive?
Thanks for having me here, Sue. If everyone can hear me okay? Yes, great. And it was also really great to hear from Connor, because basically the scholarship backs up a lot of what he has said, which is I came to this project interested in women students and oral assessments, and the literature really shows that these have been considered a male-oriented assessment, that men tend to prefer this assessment, that men tend to rate themselves higher on this assessment, and women tend to underrate themselves due to sort of confidence issues. And that's in the context more broadly of bias against young women's voices. But it's also more expansive. As Connor has highlighted, it can be exclusive for those with English as a second language, those who have voice issues, or those with neurodiversity. But as Connor also highlighted, there's so many benefits with oral assessments in terms of assuring academic integrity. It's a really great way to test students' communication skills in terms of on-the-spot kind of critical thinking and problem solving. Students themselves really value oral assessments as well. And so it's getting that balance, I think, between the benefits and challenges to make them more inclusive. And Connor's already highlighted a few solutions that seem to be the way to go.
Thanks, Maria. So it sounds as if then there's an alignment between what your research has been saying and what Connor said.
Definitely. And I think the most problematic aspect of oral assessments is in the presentation skills. That they've already been problematic because of how vague they can be. So you might see a rubric that says tone of voice, but there's no more guidance about, is that about pitch or speed, or there might be, you know, a body language, but what does that actually look like? So I think if we're considering how to make these assessments more inclusive, the rubric definitely needs to only be focused on criteria that assesses knowledge rather than how it's communicated. And in terms of interaction in the bias, I think as well, a lot of training with teachers on checking their own biases when they're marking.
Yeah, so training beforehand and perhaps moderation after, just to make sure everyone's in alignment.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. And Maria, staying with you for a little bit longer, what are some of the things that you've noticed in your teaching that can help make oral assessment less intimidating for students?
So I ran a workshop earlier this year with some students focusing on the three main challenges that students find with oral assessment. One is uncertainty about content. And so that was really encouraging them to prepare and get across what they're actually saying, so they can demonstrate that depth of knowledge and critical thinking and problem solving. The second aspect they fear is judgment. So we're doing a lot of practice with questions and answers, so they feel confident at being able to answer questions, I think. And the third aspect is actually a fear of physical symptoms. So that's when we have to think a bit more creatively, and we were doing box breathing exercises and meditation, and the students actually found that really valuable.
I think that there's a lot of us in the room. I'm watching some nodding. People are relating to that. So it's obviously not just students, it's all of us that have experienced those physical symptoms. And it's awful, that feeling. So getting used to that and helping to do that breathing and helping others to understand that we're all in that box. Amali has been doing some quite different work and in a very different context. Amali Dias is originally from Sri Lanka and arrived in Australia for her PhD in engineering from the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering at the University of Melbourne. She's currently a senior lecturer in Internet of Things at Deakin and is involved in delivering embedded systems units in the School of IT. She's also the academic director of the Makerspace and Student Integrity and Success. Her current research interests include Internet of Things, passive optical networks, edge computing, and engineering education. So, Imali, your work has involved a program called On Track and use of discussions throughout the trimester to assure learning. Can you please give us an overview of what On Track is and how in-person conversations can add to that?
For sure. So On Track is a bit different from the standard D2Ls that we have in the university. So how it works is in the On Track, so we have pass, credit, distinction, and high distinction tasks associated with the unit, but the students can choose which grade they want to go for. For example, in the beginning, they can opt for a HD or distinction, but as they progress through, they can choose which grade they can go for. And how it works is, for example, so if they have, if a student has gone for a credit grade, and then all the tasks that are associated with the credit grade will be displayed to them, and they submit their task, and it is not marked straight away, for example, marked as complete or anything. But we look through it, and then if it is done very well, then we mark it as complete. But if there are any questions, we can ask them through the discussion option that is available on the On Track. So that is how the On Track system usually works. And if it is not meeting the standard, then we can actually give them a resubmit or a redo based on how they have addressed the task requirement. So that was how the On Track was being used before. Even now, that is the case. But then what happened was, so earlier, before the GenAI, because the students were pretty much doing the things on their own or talking to their friends, it gave us a good feeling about whether the students are achieving the outcomes that we wanted from the unit, because they would submit something and then we'll realize, oh, the student is not up to the mark. We will give them feedback or ask questions through the discussion option, and they will reply to us. But with the GenAI, now the students are using GenAI and then submitting. So we are no longer marking the students, but more like GenAI. So what we found in the entire school is that the amount of distinction and high distinctions are increasing, because we cannot see whether it is the students' capabilities or something else that is happening. So because of that, a lot of us has to incorporate something on top of On Track, which used to assess and provide the students and guide the students actually through the learning process. So on top of that, we have to now incorporate discussion. So what I have done in my unit, because my unit is very hands-on hardware intensive unit, so I thought I'm very much safe from GenAI, because you have to do certain things in the unit to demonstrate that you know the things. But the students would just get a code from GenAI and then just run it and then show that it is working. I use video submissions to prove that. But now even when I see a video submission, I don't know whether the student has understood these things or not. So because of that, on top of On Track, what I do in my unit is I select 3 past stars where I know would cover pretty much all the unit learning outcomes, and I do in-person discussions. So instead of doing discussions on the On Track, so we do discussions like general discussion on Track, and give feedback on track. But on top of that, we meet the students in person or online for the cloud students and do the discussions there. But these discussions are more like friendly chats and feedback sessions rather than as a marking session, just to asking questions to see if the students have actually understood the things. Yeah.
Fantastic. So essentially, On Track allows the students to have agency and choose what grade they want to aim for, and they can go up or down over time if they change their minds, since the assessment types that they're submitting are a little bit different depending on that.
Yeah.
And then when you're checking whether they know what they've submitted, you're asking them questions in a really casual environment in the tutorial session.
Yeah, so we use the normal tutorial sessions for the on-campus students, and even for the on-campus students, if there are students who are a bit shy to present with the others, and some students have different abilities, so we take that into consideration. But we usually do this in our tutorial environment. So it's more like, oh, can you please, and we try to keep these questions related to what they have submit rather than keeping it more generic, like, can you explain this concept, sort of things. Like, I would go and can you explain what you meant by this part of the code? Can you tell me how it relates to what I have taught in the class, sort of thing. So they understand now. So even if they rely on ChatGPT to get the code, at least they have to understand it and then use it. I think we sort of have to accept that people use ChatGPT. We use it sometimes as well, but then the difference is, what do we use it for? Like, if it is to understand something, that is okay. But if it is just output method, that's where the problem is going to be.
Yeah. So essentially, you ensure that the students have done the learning, regardless of whether they've used ChatGPT or other forms of GenAI. That's really not the point for you. It's that they've done the learning.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And what you've said to me a little while ago about this is that if they have used ChatGPT, that's really irrelevant. It's as long as they've done the learning, they can go back and they can do more. Is that right? And
Yes.
resubmit.
Yeah. So we give that opportunity, and sometimes when you have a look at their code, you can see now how the ChatGPT generate the code and give you, and it's very easy to see. And sometimes we ask, did you use ChatGPT by any chance? It looks like something generated, and sometimes they would say yes, but then our question would be, but do you understand what it does? What different things? And I think, because it is more like a friendly chat, and we use it as a feedback session for them, so they understand, okay, so it's not okay just to go to ChatGPT and then copy paste it, because at some point our learning is going to be evaluated, and that is more important. So they spend some time to understand those things, and and we provide a good feedback. Yeah.
Thank you. And it sounds as if that's really developmental. Even though it's assurance of learning, it's still an opportunity to learn. Imali, I think that you might be a great person to ask about the online space, because you've got a fairly high proportion of online students. So the flexibility of online learning can be very important to the access and success of a range of students who have work, caring, or community responsibilities. That includes a higher proportion of equity and equity-like student groups, such as low SES students, mature age students, women, and Indigenous students. Rural and remote students often study online to avoid excess travel and associated costs, and to broaden their access and options. Inclusion means accounting for the diverse needs of these students too. However, there are some substantial concerns about assuring learning for online students. So, Amali, what approaches have you used or are you considering using to assure learning inclusively for these students?
Actually, so because even before these Gen AI aspects came into play, because I had around 50-50 online and on-campus students in my unit, and it is a hardware unit. So when we wanted the students to do at least the final project demonstration, we had to do it either through Teams or Zoom. So what we would usually do is, because we also understand, so we have online classes also weekly, but the attendance is very poor because they are caring for families, like these are parents, and some are from different states as well, so their working hours are quite different. So because of that, they would later on listen to the recordings of the class. So that is usually what happened. But at least for the demonstration sessions, which were like the final project demo, they would come for the session and then show us what they have done. So we pretty much did the same thing for these tasks that we were doing discussions for. So we would allocate, but whereas the on-campus students had their dedicated tutorial sessions, for the online students, we would allocate each day of the week for the demo week. Specifically because we understand if we just put them, okay, so during the 2 hours of the class, you come and demo, it's not going to work for them. They actually struggled with coming to the class and with the timing. So we would at least allocate 2 hours each day. And sometimes we try to allocate it during their lunchtime as well. So something that will overlap with their lunchtime and also during 7 to 9 sort of a thing where they can actually come back from work and do it. Yeah, so that's the approach.
Fantastic. So you're giving advance warning so that they can arrange childcare or work. You're flexibly scheduling so that they can do things in their lunch breaks and after work, those sorts of things.
Yeah. But I should mention that this requires a lot of cooperation from the unit staff, which I was very fortunate to have. Like I have one of the best tutors for supporting me for that, who also understand like the different situations of the students as well. So that was very important for me and very helpful for me in implementing that. But it requires a lot of support from the staff.
Yeah. And just out of curiosity, what sort of size, what sort of numbers are we talking about for students?
So in my unit, it's around 150 to 200 in each cohort, and I have around 50% online cohort for that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Amali. And Joanna Tai is Associate Professor at Cradle here at Deakin. She's an assessment and feedback researcher who has co-designed and researched inclusive assessments and is currently studying how students use GenAI in assessment tasks. Joanna is a Senior Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a member of the Australian and New Zealand Association for Health Professions Education and the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction. Jo, you've been researching and co-designing in the space of inclusive assessment for a while now. What can previous research and practice knowledge about inclusive assessment tell us about how to address the challenges of assuring learning now in an inclusive way?
Thanks, Sue, and hopefully my unique lapel mic is working okay. I guess I've been interested in this conundrum really about how we can make assessment more inclusive for a number of years. And I've spoken to quite a number of students over that time. And I think if I could sum it up, there's no one answer that's going to fix all the problems because students are diverse. And all of the different courses, the different disciplines, the professions also are extremely diverse in what matters in terms of knowledge, in terms of practice. So what works is going to be something a little bit different in each situation. But there are some things that we can agree upon that aren't very inclusive. And I think Connor and Will have kind of already alluded to things like exams not being great, especially locked down in person, time limited, requiring a lot of recall. That isn't inclusive. And even from like an online student's perspective, certainly we've had students talking about how difficult it was for them to travel to like a regional examination centre to get there in time for their exam, if they have accommodations or adjustments, to actually figure out if those things have been provided for in those situations. So we know that there are some things that we should probably try not to do. In terms of what works better, I think, again, Maria and Amali and Connor have also talked about things about being very clear about what the assessment task is going to be about, ensuring any rubrics or guidelines are prepared well in advance, so that everyone has a clear understanding of what it is that is being assessed. So taking it back to those learning objectives or learning outcomes. And also offering practice opportunities, as Maria was talking about, really scaffolding capability rather than expecting students to do something that perhaps they've never done before in their life. And I think we need to continue thinking about that as we institute new forms of assessment or new configurations of assessment, because just as we are trying to invent new things to try and cope with GenAI, our students also haven't encountered that before. And so we all kind of need a little bit more preparation to go, okay, well, if this is the assessment task, what do we need to do in the lead up to actually doing it? What kind of things do I need to learn, practice, develop? Marla was talking about logistics. From the educator perspective, there's also a lot of logistics that we need to think about that perhaps we didn't have to worry about previously. And so, yeah, it's going to be a little bit context specific about what things we choose to institute. But overall, if we're thinking about these things and planning for them, then hopefully we're going to do a better job than if we hadn't.
Fantastic. So it sounds really as if we're introducing sometimes very new assessments to students, and we need to make sure that it's not just us that's across what that assessment entails, it's the students, and really giving them developmental opportunity to get used to that assessment approach as well as the content itself.
Exactly.
Yeah. So Jo, just sticking with you for a minute, one of the issues raised about assurance of learning assessment is that it must have adversarial security features, which can create greater stress, pressure, and anxiety for students. Is security always necessary for assurance of learning?
Yeah, that's another tricky $1 million question, Sue. And actually, just before at lunchtime, we were talking about what security even means. And my ideas about security were a little bit different from your ideas about security. So I think that's the first thing to do. To be clear about what we mean by secure. One of the biggest things about assurance of learning is, we need to make sure that the student who says they are who they are can actually do the thing that we are hoping that they have learnt how to do. And that implies some things about, maybe needing to witness some kind of performance, maybe seeing them in person to make sure that they are who they say they are. But I think, for a very long time, there have been many ways that people can evade the normal systems of assessment, get somebody else to complete the assessment for them, get some help in the exam. These are not new problems. They've existed for some time. And I think while we want to push people towards the direction of doing the right thing, and I think most students do actually want to do the right thing. They want to get the degree. They want to, have a piece of paper that says, actually, I can do these things and I'm qualified to go out into the world. But there are also a small bunch of people for whom they'll always try and do a workaround. So I guess with GenAI being such an available, easy to use tool that maybe makes us a little bit more lazy, makes it easier for us to complete tasks, how do we still ensure that students are actually, doing the learning and can demonstrate that learning? And that's, I guess, where the security and the assessment security comes in, because it kind of says, well, there are all these things that we could try and do to, make ourselves more certain that this student can do this thing. So yeah, I think some security is necessary, but when we say security, we should be thinking about it in terms of, can this student do the thing that we hope that they can do, rather than it being, let's impose ridiculous restrictions on what students can or cannot access. Let's impose restrictions on how long it takes. These things might, in some way, maybe help us make some inferences about what students can or cannot do without the support of other things. But I think ultimately, hopefully we can design tasks that enable students to do that without being too restrictive, because I think, and certainly from the research, a lot of students that I've spoken to have kind of really called out those really inauthentic forms of assessment where, they are sitting down in a room with nothing else. This is not how life looks like beyond the university setting. So why are we trying to pretend that this is an important thing to assess?
Emily, were you wanting to say something to that?
No, I think that is very true, so and Joe, because from the assessment point of view, I think there needs to be a lot of things that we have to, rather than just saying, oh, the students are just using it, because we did a fair bit of restructuring in our units as well, so which sort of prevents them, like it the way that we have restructured the assessment. So in a way, you cannot just copy paste something on ChatGPT and put an answer to that. So we come up with some innovative projects that they can do. So these are not like off the shelf that you can just put in. The otherwise, what happened was the student would just go and say, "Give me the code to detect the temperature of the room." So that doesn't, then we know they will just copy paste it, and then that is not where they get the learning. So adjusting for example, we had a lot of problems where the reports were involved in our school, so they would just go and copy paste things. And the thing is, we cannot even raise an academic integrity issue with these sort of things unless you have like definite proof. So then all these things go undetected in the system while the students are not learning anything at all. So there was like a clear identification even in the School of IT, like the assessments need to be changed in order to better facilitate the assurance of learning. Yeah.
So it sounds to me as if really we're talking about if a student can use ChatGPT very easily in assessment and we don't want them to, using an approach to try to catch them in itself is not an inclusive approach. It sounds as if really, if we're going to be inclusive, then we need to design an assessment that allows the student to do the task and doesn't allow them to accidentally do something that we don't want them to, or on purpose do something you don't want them to. Because anecdotally, we catch more equity students and equity-like students than others when we are using those sorts of systems where we're punishing.
Yeah, because I think in terms of the Gen AI, it should not be just a process of just catching them and punishing them. It should be educating them. How can you use it? But at the same time, you do the learning with some sort of integrity, like the academic integrity that is expected. Like we used to refer to books, we used to do Google search, right? But what we still did, do the learning. That was the difference from that time. So now you use the books, you use the Google search, plus you do the Gen AI, but then do it in a way that will still ensure your learning. If you are catching up, sometimes my son, if he doesn't understand certain thing, he would come and he will use Gen AI to catch up on things because he did not understand certain things, but he would still verify, are these the right things, verify with the teachers whether. So that sort of learning still should happen. So with the interactions with the unit staff still happen. If that is the case, then the Gen AI is just a tool they're using to better understand certain things, but not to just produce assessment and then get through the system very easily.
Yeah. So what's popping up for me is that students are not Pokemon. You don't have to catch them all. Sorry, I have a 7-year-old son. Will, you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think on that point of Gen AI and trying to, I guess, protect against it or discourage students from using it, I think it's very important to highlight that in order to create future-ready graduates, they need to know how to use these tools. We don't want to be discouraging them. I think we want to be doing the opposite. We want to encourage them. I think I look at myself, I'm like, well, in 5 years, the world's going to be a very different place. And having these AI skills, while also knowing the content, is what's going to get me employed, and it's what's going to kind of keep things moving. And I think it was the other day ANZ that loading off a ton of people because of AI and stuff. So I think it's very important that students are able to use it, because at the end of the day they're going to use it. It's very hard to, I guess, protect against it considering its capabilities. And I think it's important to encourage the proper and, I guess, ethical and that the proper use of it, while also ensuring that you're making sure they know why they need to know it, not not just not just use ChatGPT, I guess.
Yeah. And I suppose to an extent, when you're setting an assessment where students can use ChatGPT and we're telling them not to and relying on catching them, it's very similar to our old approach of having an online assessment and saying just don't sit down with your friends and do it at the same time, just crossing your fingers and hoping that that's the case. Will and Connor, do you have any examples of really inclusive assessment practice that you've experienced or seen, or if not, what you'd like to see?
I'm happy to go first. I think, one of the things that really caught my eye was when you kind of talked about scaffolding assessments. I think in law, I remember being first trimester, straight out of high school, you never, you're a law baby essentially. And your first assessment is basically to write a case analysis, I recall. And I'm like, I remember the classes not really being about that, but more like because it was an introductory law unit. There, it's kind of like 1 week's a very brief overview of each different area. And I remember having this assignment, and I'm just looking. I'm like, I have never seen this before. Like, I have no reference point on like where I should start. And I think what I found in later units that they picked up more on was, well, you might have 2 or 3 assessments in a trimester, but maybe your first assessment's an essay plan. Maybe the second one's, writing a piece of it, and then the final one's actually putting the full thing together. I had that when I was overseas as well. Overseas, they did it a bit differently, where the first assessment was a formative, so it didn't actually count towards the grade. But the first assessment was a plan for your second assessment, and basically, based on that, you could get really good feedback, and you're in the right direction, rather than writing the whole thing and kind of fingers crossed it's somewhere in the realm of what they want.
So we're talking about scaffolding, and scaffolding is inbuilt in assessments, and we're talking about different types of assessments as well. Yeah. Did you have anything that you wanted to add, Connor?
Not too much, but I did want to actually echo what Will was saying. Scaffolding assessments are pretty cool. Especially in foundational units where you're expecting a lot of first years to be doing it. In my last course of construction management, there was a lot of scaffolding assessments, and they were very helpful to help people understand how to format create the right scientific reports and things like that. And I can say that I kind of wish we had that in social work when it came to writing case reviews and things like that. But other than that, I was just going to say the other type of accessible thing that I've seen with oral sort of assessments is providing sort of different options for who you're presenting in front of. So I have had assessments before where you actually get to choose whether you want to do it in front of the class, either one-on-one with whoever your teacher is, whether unit chair or tutor, or even in some cases, just being able to record yourself and then send that through, which has been very helpful for me personally.
Yeah, fantastic. So having choice, again, returning to that agency piece, and even if you need to present in your future career, then you don't necessarily need to start there in first year. Connor, in terms of that scaffolding, in terms of work integrated learning, doing things like pracs, scaffolding and getting you ready for that, is there something that you would like to see?
It's sort of hard for me to say for certain because I'm only first year and my prac is until third year. But I do know that the way that my course is set up is that essentially the units themselves are scaffolding. Like they build upon each other so that you have the baseline skills for your first practical, and then it repeats again for the second prac. But just basically, I suppose maybe trying to get more coordination between unit chairs. I can't really speak for social work because it's only first year, but especially in some of my other courses, a lot of the time you'd have just no communication at all between the unit chairs. So there'd be overlapping content that you'd be repeating stuff, or that there'd be ones where they jump ahead and then you'd talk to them about it and they would just basically say, well, you should have learned this in the prior unit. So maybe just more sort of general open communication, and I guess team planning, I suppose, just for like a lot of the core units in a course, I think would go a long way.
Yeah, fantastic. So that continuity and connection. So let's wrap up now so that we can open up shortly for audience Q&A. I wondered if each of you might like to say a few final words on this last question. And Maria, I'll invite you to speak first because I'm mindful that you'll need to leave first. What stands out to you as most important to keep in mind for inclusion as academics and third space staff go about designing new assessment tasks to assure learning?
Thanks very much for that question. And I'd like to build on something that Joe said, and I think might go to some of the questions. I'm trying to preempt some, which is you're never going to get it perfect with inclusivity. And I've learned that through some of the interviews that I've been doing with women students. So I've had women students with a neurodiversity say they love doing oral assessments, or students, women students with English as a second language who also excel at oral assessments rather than written assessments. And so I think they are very valuable to implement, and I understand that they're expensive and labour intensive as well, but I don't think you have to make them perfect the first time. And there is really great growing body of scholarship out there from Griffith University, University of Queensland, that actually tell you how to do this. And also, as Joe would know, medical faculties have been doing this for a while. So tap into your colleagues across the university about how we can at least get a start on trying to do these as well as we can. Like I've learnt so much today from Amali about how she's doing it too.
I think that's really important because health sciences has been doing this for a very long time. And particularly as well, there are third space staff who work with a wide range of different faculties and schools. And so they can sometimes communicate across and help pass that information on as well. I'll say thank you and wave goodbye, Maria, because I know that you need to head off. But I'll pass across to the others to answer that question as well. So if everyone wanted to wish Maria a goodbye and thank you. And so open to any of you, what would you like staff to keep in mind as they go about designing these new assessment tasks to assure learning?
I guess I'm happy to start. I think a couple things. I think my first point is that when designing these assessment tasks, I think it's important to, think about the future as well. I think as we spoke about Gen AI, I think, I know from my experience, you either get teaching staff who are pro, use it 100%, and you'll get some people who are like, no, don't touch it, like it's banned in assessment. So I think, when designing these assessment tasks, inclusion is important, but it's also important to, help students build those future skills that they're going to need as they go out into the workforce. And, it's not just about how to use Gen AI, but how to, use those critical skills to examine what the AI is telling you and, actually make sure that what it's giving you is what you want. Because I think a lot of students just blindly copy and paste it, whatever, they don't check it. That's how they often get caught out. But I think really giving students those skills and helping them to assess them in a way that's, encouraging them to not copy paste, but, use it in a way they're going to use it in the future, but while also having that assurance of learning and understanding how, these things work.
So translating that into our academic sphere, assurance of learning is important, but also assessment for learning is important, and assessment for learning that incorporates AI. Yeah. Connor?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I understand that academic staff are extremely busy. But I was going to say, when it comes to, if you're looking for ideas on things that might be accessible, tap into the student body. Because, I mean, at Deakin, for example, there's a student club called Deakin Disability and Neurodivergency Association in Burwood. I'm just part of the Geelong branch, but in Burwood. And there's a whole community of people that would usually be willing to talk about what they find helpful. And there's also people like the Disability Resource Centre and a bunch of other student bodies around the country even that are usually happy to talk about things that they find help them with assessments. So if you're looking for ideas on that, talk to the students.
Fantastic. And of course, at Deakin, there's the students as partners coffee conversations that runs, and there's bodies that allow you to interact with students in all sorts of different places. Yeah, fantastic. Jo or Amali?
Thank you. I think so. There are when we were designing these things, and also coming from these academic integrity hearings as well. I think sometimes we have to, as Con also mentioned, we have to think about it from the student perspective. Why did they use it? Why do they use it? Because sometimes it's you can be an international student, so you are not very sure when you submit this report if your English is good, right? And sometimes you might have different abilities which requires you to use it, but then you don't know to which extent can you use it, and when you do an assignment, what is right and what is wrong in the use of GenAI. I think we haven't clearly said that to the students. Sometimes it's the problem. Sometimes we just say, oh, you can use GenAI to assist, but what do you mean by assist? What do you define by assist? So sometimes in our classes we show them, when we say assist, this is what we mean, but you cannot just go and copy paste the code, because then you did not understand anything. So I think being very clear about the use of GenAI, and then how you can use it to assist, as we mentioned it, and then how they can actually, go beyond GenAI and actually improve their learning and then showcase their learning is something that is very important. I think we have to acknowledge the diversity of the students and then understand it from their perspective, and design our assessment also so that we do not penalize the students for their diverse factors. So if we try to do that in our assessment, I think the students would not go into the extent of using the GenAI the way they do.
Yeah, fantastic. Something that's really stuck with me, Kane Murdoch once said, you say to trust your students, but I trust them to have lots of different priorities that we're not aware of. Sorry, Kane, if you're listening, I'm paraphrasing you heavily here. But, he trusts them to have different perspectives, different pressures and different things happening. And so we can set things up to make sure that we account for that in the front end. Yeah. Jo.
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I've got two things. Firstly, and I mentioned it in the chat already, that we should be thinking about structural versus discursive changes to assessment and restrictions in assessment. So the discursive stuff is just the things that we tell students to do, but we can't be sure that they are going to or not going to do those things, as per previous discussion there. Structural changes, however, are the things that ensure that students can either use or not use GenAI. So we have to think carefully about where to implement these things. I've also seen in the chat some suggestions towards that programmatic view of assessment, where it's not every assessment that has to look the same and have the same restrictions. By the end of a program, whatever the degree is, we need to make sure that students know and can do things by the end of that degree, but that doesn't mean that everything throughout the degree is secured in the same way. The other thing I wanted to say was that while we are definitely very concerned and we want to make sure that student outcomes are good, we also have to think about the student experience of assessment and probably also the educator experience of assessment. So how the process feels, what it asks us to do, all of these things are important, and we need to keep those things in mind as well when we're designing and making decisions about what we are asking everyone to do in assessment.
Thanks, Jo. And I love that you mentioned the educator there as well, because if we're truly an inclusive university, then we need to be inclusive of our educators as well. Our educators are diverse people just as much as our students are, and they also have many different experiences and different needs. Yeah. So I'm going to now call for questions. First, though, to the online audience, there'll be some of you who do need to leave now. Before you do, I want to ask you to please fill out our feedback survey, and the link being shown in the chat and perhaps up on the screen in a moment. The survey will only take about 2 minutes, but it really helps us to determine what our impact is and to demonstrate that and to develop or improve our future sessions. So please, please, can I ask that you do that survey? So now I'd like to open the floor for questions, and I've realised my critical failure is not giving you a microphone. So I I might see if we can come to you second, Yuso, and we'll go to one in the room first.
Hi, my name's Isia. I'm a researcher in Reddy, and just a small thing I wanted to mention that perhaps might save some people going down rabbit holes in terms of research is I'm assuming when we talk about oral assessment, we're talking about verbal assessment, because oral assessment's a key phrase in dentistry when you're assessing the oral cavity. So oral assessment, yes. I'm assuming it's verbal assessment we're talking about.
Thank you. Ever the clarifier. Okay, Yuso, what are we hearing from online? Can I ask Hasti, can you bring the mic over to Yuso for a moment? Thank you.
Thank you. Oof, we do have a couple of burning questions here. Many of them are those million-dollar questions that we are absolutely not able to answer within the remaining time, but I would be very happy to hear some of your insights. Let's start from a bit of a tricky one. There is an anonymous attendee who has asked you about, after all this talk about assurance of learning, what should we actually be assessing in the first place? So the attendee is asking, do we need to reassess what learning we are trying to assure? Are the skills now obsolete in the light of GenAI? There was some talk about, for example, the fostering students' AI literacies and so forth, but any thoughts from any of you on what should we be assessing and assuring in the first place?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one at a conceptual level. I did mention earlier that higher education involves a lot of different people doing a lot of different things. So learning objectives, outcomes, whatever it is that we're attempting to assess and assure, probably differs depending on what we aim students to become once they leave the university. So I don't think there's going to be a single answer. But in response to the should we be reconsidering? Yes. And we should constantly reconsider what we are assessing and how that is assessed, because times change, technology improves. What a lawyer was called upon to do 20 years ago probably doesn't look like what a lawyer is called upon to do today. Similarly, social work, I'm pretty sure just personal experience of trying to navigate aged care assessments and all that kind of stuff. That looks very different, thanks government. So yes, we do need to continue refreshing, iterating. It's not something that we can set and forget.
And Yuso, let's do one more from online before we go to the room.
Alrighty. Well, there are quite a few questions about, perhaps a bit unsurprisingly, about our funding, resources, time, space allocations. And I'm just trying to synthesize what I think is maybe around 17 questions in the chat and in the Q&A. Any thoughts about what sorts of strategies should we need to have in the future to ensure that we have all the funding, time, resources needed to do assessment in ways that is both meaningful and that can be reassured?
I suppose just one thing I want to jump in with first on that. So I was the course director for the Bachelor of Health Science in Myotherapy for quite a while, and that's a lot of hands-on assessments. And what we found is that for educators, it's not tenable to have whole days of practical exams. You're no longer objectively assessing students anymore, and you're not doing a great job at your own job at that point. You just can't. So scheduling that across a longer period of time and smaller chunks, and that can sometimes give greater flexibility and inclusion for the students too, because that gives a greater range of times. And if something goes wrong, it allows for rescheduling and it doesn't create a critical failure for your system. If you're only assessing over 1 or 2 days with lots of assessors, then that's a really small piece of time that students have to make sure that they can arrange their whole lives around that. The other thing that I found is that when you're in person, if you can get the marking done in that moment, then it actually does save time. So the marking burden can be lower, and I tended to find that it was less stressful. I would much rather, even though I've just said don't do a whole day of assessment that's practical, I would much rather do a whole day of prac assessment than do a whole day of written assessment. And in fact, I don't think I could read that much. So those sorts of things, doing that in advance can allow for a bit more flexibility for you and for the student. And it doesn't necessarily have to cost more money because there's less marking time, and so that burden can actually kind of play out a little bit more broadly. And you can take some assessments away. Some of our assessments are just not necessary, and so we can save money that we then spend on a more expensive assessment elsewhere by taking one away. So really thinking critically. And I know it's like when my 7-year-old, when I tell him, okay, it's your birthday, as it was last week, you need to give up some of your toys so that you've got room for your new ones. That's like, you know, like I've just told him that is, you know, yeah, it's horrific. And this is sometimes how we feel about assessments, but we just need to really think critically what's not necessary. Anyone else wanted to answer?
No, I agree, because even in the discussions that I'm doing in my unit, I couldn't do it for all the past stars. Like I have around 9 past stars, but if I or my tutor tries to do it, we wouldn't be able to actually engage with the students like as a overall cohort. So we have just selected 3 out of them. And these were earlier, we used to assess distinction and high distinction just to see if these students are gaining the knowledge. But now we have flipped it and it's more like pass, because I want to make sure at least do you understand the core concepts that we are trying to teach you. So that was the main aim with this introduction of GenAI that we have changed. And then we have selected like 2 quotas we knew would be addressing across the unit learning outcomes that we have. So we have selected those 2, and then the project demo where they will be integrating all their learning. So that's how we have selected it. Otherwise, we cannot keep up. Like even we feel drained after all the project demos and demonstration sessions. So just selecting the ones I found, yeah, that worked for us.
Yeah, I think I don't have any advice, but I have a personal kind of experience with this particular issue. It was one of my law electives actually, and we had a scaffold assessment where you do the plan, and then later you do the actual assignment. And the issue we had is that we didn't have the actual. There was not the resourcing from staff to be able to actually mark all those assessments. And what ended up happening was that the plans ended up taking like 5 or 6 weeks to actually get marked. And the second assessment had to basically get pushed out basically to the very end of the trimester. And I think that, that created a very bad experience for students. And, basically as our one tutor was marking them, she was individually extending due dates based on when she got to each of those. And I think at one point she just extended it for everyone, and it was just disastrous. And, I think, yeah, it wasn't a great experience for students either.
Yeah. And I think probably it's useful for us to acknowledge that that's going to happen. While we figure this stuff out, that's probably going to happen, and it's going to happen to a lot of us. But hopefully learning from that experience and just doing it differently next time. I think Jason Lodge just recently published what wasn't a paper, what was it? A blog about what happened when we tried to draw the owl, talking about some of the things that went wrong. And I really liked that because he was very open about the stuff that went wrong, and particularly what he would do completely differently next time. And we're going to have those, but hopefully improving is the thing we want to do. Let's go to another one from the room.
Hi, Robin Nugel here from DLF. My question's primarily for Connor and Will. I've been talking to staff about assurance of learning tasks because we're doing a great big mapping project across the university at the moment to work out which tasks are assured and which ones aren't. And I'm getting a lot of feedback from CB staff that they like the idea of an interactive oral assessment, which of course is very different from an oral exam. It's that role play where you play the role of the expert and the assessor is the role of the client or the person in need of advice, as Sue explained earlier. And I'm hoping you can do some of my homework for me, because on Thursday I'm meeting with somebody from our, I can't remember what they're called now, but peer and academic support team, because I asked them, do you have any resources that could be used to support students in what these kind of assessments entail, interactive orals, and what they would need to do to prepare for them, and just some sort of academic skill advice, I guess, in how to deal with that assessment. If you were going to have one of these assessments where you were asked to give advice to someone in a social work setting or in a law setting, what would you think you would need?
This reminds me of one. It wasn't as interactive, but more kind of role playing. It was a bail application where we basically had to pretend with a lawyer, record ourselves. And I think, surprising, the one thing that really helped, I think, that contrast to an oral, where an oral, I think, is very much about you personally. I think when you're in those role plays, you can very much put, the professional going into's hat on, and you don't have to be yourself per se. It's not an oral where you're just, you're trying to share knowledge, but it's you. I found with the bail application, if you kind of put your lawyer hat on, pretend to be a lawyer, it's a lot more fun. But also, I think, if you're thinking like that, you're, I guess, it's more, you find you're less worried. I guess for me, I found I was less worried about how I was conveying it and stuff. And I found it easier, removing the kind of the personal element from it.
Thanks, Will. I think that's a really useful one. That's definitely going in a guide.
Well, I think what Will was saying is correct, but also I've actually done one of those in architecture when I was doing that, and that was not very fun. But basically, for me, it really comes down to setting expectations. I've always found that I tend to perform much better when either there's practical examples that can be given or just better instruction on what I'm actually expecting. When I did architecture last year, for example, there was very limited sort of explanation of the sort of questions you'd maybe get asked, or like exactly what people were looking for. And it felt extremely subjective, but that's just part of art stuff anyway. But for social work, though, I would say, because we have to do role plays, which I think will end up being very similar to what you're describing, just like maybe, honestly, lots of prep, lots of practical examples, if possible. And I know this is not always possible, but like maybe an example of one to like a video or something you can watch. And I think that would help immensely with cooling nerves and also just generally setting out the expectations for the student.
Perfect. Thanks, Connor. We've got all that down. That's excellent. Thank you so much.
Before I go back to you, so for another online question, I just wanted to mention or call out what Connor had said there about the exemplars and actually being able to watch an exemplar of it going well, because scaffolding and doing this in class doesn't necessarily give you an idea of what it looks like when it's done really well. And what some students who are neurodivergent have in common with some first in family students is that they may feel very uncomfortable with that uncertainty of not knowing what to expect, not knowing what's expected of them. So a videoed exemplar is fantastic, I think, worth its weight in gold. Hasti, can you possibly come across to Yuso, what else have we got online?
Sure. We are going to jump into the most upvoted questions. So this really resonated with the audience today and really continues from the previous question very nicely. Relates to in-person assessments. And let me just read it by Joshua Johnson. So Joshua is writing that, I'm interested in strategies that allow moderation of in-person based assessments that don't further increase the stress and consequently performance that many students experience with this type of assessment. Both multiple assessors and recording strategies seem problematic. Any thoughts on, I'm not sure if this is even a question, but any responses to how we might hinder these sorts of situations?
That's a great question. And I think, okay, so now I'm going to speak from my experience being an assessor. My background is medicine, so I have assessed medical students on OSCEs for a number of years. And I agree that having a second person in the room can sometimes be very stressful. Also, having that experience as a student, why is there an extra person in my assessment? This is weird. That is anxiety provoking. And recording. It's interesting because I think perhaps in some situations, some courses have actually said, look, we need to record everyone's assessment because we want to do that quality assurance and There are rooms that are set up for that purpose, so the recording is not obtrusive. And if everyone knows that this is just something that happens, and there are very strict, guidelines about how that recording can be used, shared, etc., then maybe that brings a little bit more comfort. But in terms of other moderation strategies, what I always found really helpful as an assessor, because I know I'm just me and there are 20 other assessors assessing similar things on different days or the same day, different students, is to actually have that discussion, much like students might like an exemplar to see what good performance look like, is for the examiners to also see an exemplar, maybe one good, one bad, and actually have that discussion. What made this a good one? How are we going to mark this on the rubric? If there is a rubric, is it more a holistic judgment? But to actually have those discussions so that people have a shared understanding of what quality is, rather than relying on tools by themselves to do the work.
Fantastic. And Yuso, have you got any other questions? And we'll go to one from the room after that.
Oh yes, I do. Now, we've lost Maria, but we're still going to jump into one question about oral assessments. Which concerns communication skills in oral assessment situations? Do you have any insights as to how we might actively minimize bias and preconceived notions that affect human beings when marking, particularly how ingrained and unconscious those can be?
I think I just want to jump in as one of the things that I would recommend is to really critically look at what's in the rubric in the first place. So is it something that's going to be biased inherently? Is it something that needs to be in there if it is? And if it does need to be in there and it's definitely aligned to the learning outcomes, not just an authentic aspect that one day they'll need to do, but it's not actually in the learning outcomes now. If it can't be gotten rid of, then can we reword it to make it more objective? And can we potentially write some things or have some conversations with markers and students alike as to what it actually means? So if we're talking about personal interaction skills, for example, and say, for example, counselling, if we need to be assessing someone's counselling skills, then is it actually important for the person to be making eye contact? And if they are, what does that actually mean? For a neurodivergent person, what does that mean? For a blind student, what does that mean? How are they going to make eye contact? And so if they can't, then does that mean that they don't actually need to? So we need to really rethink what's in the rubric and how that might look for a different group of students or for a broad group of students. So this particular thing, how are we going to mark this? If this looks a little bit different, how are we going to mark that? So embedding that flexibility into the rubric is really important, and thinking about the diversity before it happens, not waiting until you're sitting there with your student who's not making eye contact or can't, and then trying to figure out how to deal with it. Really looking at that in advance, because we know that these students exist, because of course they do. So let's figure it out beforehand.
Maybe I can try to say something. I think basically everything that Sue has said is I agree with. Unconscious bias is a kind of an awful thing but it's good to be aware of it, obviously, because that's the first step. But I think something else to keep in mind in certain circumstances is simply part of the issue is that a lot of the presentation skills are from a neurotypical standpoint. But then you also have to remember that in things like, say, counseling, the students in the future, they may have neurodivergent patients. And so as a result, it really is a matter of you have to really ask yourself, is maintaining stern eye contact actually necessary? And in some cases, it can actually make things worse depending on the patient. And instead, just maybe just focus on the real core fundamentals of not coming across as judgmental and things like that. But unfortunately, even that has some sort of room for bias, sadly.
These are some proper $1 million answers to some $1 million questions.
Okay, Hasti, so let's take one from the room.
Okay. Oh, all right. Thank you.
Alex, you can go next.
Hi, I'm Kathy Legg from School of Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm also part of the Transforming Assessment project in Faculty of Arts and Ed. Also read that paper on discursive and structural changes, which is excellent. My question is to Amali. So you were talking about the supplement to the on-track system where you have the very friendly chat with the students. So my question is, what if you're having the friendly chat and the student obviously has not done the learning and doesn't understand? What do you do then? What do you do with, there is a kind of student that will try to charm their way out of it. And if it's a friendly chat, then if you actually, double down and say, actually, I think you don't understand, there goes the friendliness. So there will be all kinds of pressures there. Yeah, I'm just concerned about how that's navigated.
That's a very, very good question. And although we run these as sort of like feedback sessions, we also provide this formal feedback in the on-track system itself. For example, during this session, if we find out, oh, the student has not understood these concepts, so then we provide that feedback in the on-track system so that later on, when we are assessing their final portfolio, we could see, oh, the student did not demonstrate these skills during the demonstration session. So they have to, so we tell them, look, at this stage, you have not addressed these learning outcomes. It does not look like you understand this part of the code, how it works, how it is contributing to the overall assessment. So in your final portfolio submissions, you need to address these things. And we put that in the comment section. And then these are some of the important things that we check. Because with the on-track system, the thing is, it's their final portfolio that is the assessment task. So until then, they are able to make changes based on the feedback that we give. Yeah.
Okay, so one more in the room and then we'll go back to you, So.
Thank you. I'm Alex Green. I'm with the Students and Partners team. This is for anybody because I'd love to hear student or educator perspective on this. But thinking about what Will was saying about we're sort of all learning to adapt to something like AI, not just our students. Do you think there's a way that students can become more involved in having input in the co-design of their assessment? And if so, what would that look like from your perspective? How's that for $1 million question?
I can start, but then I'd really love to hear from Connor and Will if they've got any cool ideas too. And I think Kelly Matthews is someone who I respect greatly and who has done a lot of thinking in this space. And I think assessment is that last bastion of like, oh, can we get students to help with this? Because it's actually the thing that we're assessing them on. And isn't that a bit weird? I think there's heaps of space for students to offer input. I think Connor already mentioned, just ask. And, you could feed that into your considerations about what's happening for the next semester. I know there are some imperfect mechanisms that sort of manage to tap all students, like our student evaluation surveys, and maybe there should be better questions in those that could be more helpful towards actually figuring out what we can change about assessment. I do know, though, that if you ask probably like 5 students, you get 5 different answers about what should be done in assessment. So there is that also balancing between academic judgment about what's important for your course, your subject, your discipline, versus what students think might be most important. And as Sue said before, students have heaps of different priorities and goals. And so I guess even if we have students studying the same course, they might want to get different things out of it. So I think the first step is to be open to the idea of students having input and then look for it wherever it might come from. It could be more formal, it could be more informal. I know Deakin has these coffee chats, which I think is a really great, less formal way, but still kind of structured, of getting student input on things that matter to them. And you could drop in some questions about assessment there. But yeah, let's hear from these guys.
Yeah, I think on your point, especially about like Deakin Evaluate, which is, our end of trimester, I think it probably gets like a 5% uptake or something. I think, and when I'm filling this out, I'm not, thinking deeply about, I'm not writing paragraphs. I think, I think making feedback a more part of the actual, I guess, units and assessments per se, maybe even, when we're doing assessments, having a spot on the submission for feedback on how we thought it went. When I think a big thing as well is like actually as students, like, it can be very hard to see how our input actually makes changes. And I think it can discourage us from, if I feel that evaluate, I'm like, well, 99% of the time I feel like probably nothing happens. And like, what's the point kind of thing? I feel like really being able to see change from start to finish is, what makes me feel included and makes, I guess, it motivates me to give feedback. There's no point in me filling out a 10-minute survey if I know nothing's going to change. Yeah. So I think really, it's having, I guess, feedback as a core part that students are going to be actually engaged to give it, but also being able to show how feedback is making changes.
And I think that's really critical, Will, because we've talked a few times now about how busy educators are, but students are incredibly busy also. And even if they weren't, what makes doing an evaluate survey more important than gaming? Like really, what makes it more important? So I think letting students know what's going to happen with that information when they put their time and effort in is really useful. I know that Deakin has a very mature Students as Partners program that's well developed, but if there isn't one in the university that you're at, then you can do other things that can help you to get input from students. And it doesn't necessarily have to be give me your opinion. What it could be is here's an exemplar of an assessment. Can you all mark it? I want to see how you interpret the rubric. I want to see what you think about this so that you can see if they've understood, so that you can see if there are lots of variations in how that rubric can be interpreted. That can be useful too. So there's lots of different ways to get information from students beyond just what's your opinion. Connor, did you have anything to add? And then we'll go to our last very, very quick question. Thanks, Connor. Okay, so one last question, but it's going to have to be a quickie.
All right, so we have a lightning round. So we're all busy. Students are busy, teachers are busy. And here we are talking about doing more of something and doing better assessments, more meaningful assessments. But doesn't that necessarily mean that we need some trade-offs? We need to do less of something. What should we give up? What should we do less of in the assessment space?
You can make more use of AI.
I think you could do less assessment, give up some assessment.
I think like you have to select what are the core things that you want to evaluate and focus on them. And at the same time, I think we are now in a race to change all our assessments and everything to make sure that we do the assurance of learning. And then I think rather than trying to do it all in one go, maybe just do one thing and then see how the students respond, and maybe based on that then it gives us better experience. So that's what, so this unit that we are redeveloping, this is in the making for like 4 years now, that we are like changing one task at a time. That makes us more easy for us to adopt, and then also the students are also getting used to it. The thing is, if they get used to one of these tasks in this unit, they're going to do a bit better in another unit as well, even though it is not the same unit that they're doing. So they get used to it. So I think I understand it's very time consuming. So what I have done is, rather than changing everything, changing one thing at a time. Yeah.
Now, sadly, we've come to the end of our time, so I'm going to need to cut things short there and close the panel. I'd like to again thank both the panelists and the audience for your time and your insights. Can you please join me in thanking Will, Connor, Imali, Joe, and of course, Maria. Thank you so much. Please do complete our survey at the link on the screen and in the chat. And if you'd like to nominate a case study, that link's up there as well. And will also be shared again when we send out the recording. Thanks again for your time. See you later.